All right, good evening everyone, and welcome to the second Northern Grapes Project webinar this season and the first of 2017. My name is Alex Caberly, and I'm a program assistant for the Northern Grapes Project. Today's webinar is Fungicide Disease Management based on Cultivar Susceptibility and Fungicide Sensitivity with Patty McManus and David Jones with University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today the speakers will discuss their recent research conducted in Wisconsin on susceptibility of cultivars to downy mildew, powdery mildew, and black rot, and how this knowledge can be integrated into disease management programs. Patty McManus is a professor and the chair of plant pathology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she collaborates on the Northern Grapes Project to evaluate cold-hardy grape varieties for diseases and sensitivity to copper and sulfur-based fungicides. Her research and extension efforts with UW-Madison focus on practical problems that impact the profitability and sustainability of growing fruit crops. David Jones is a master's candidate in the McManus lab at UW-Madison. As part of Patty McManus's collaboration with the Northern Grapes Project, David's master's research has focused on studying disease susceptibility of cold climate wine grape cultivars. Upon completing his master's degree, David will soon be an extension educator with Michigan State Extension. Remember that as a participant in this webinar, we ask that you keep your microphones muted if you have them. If you are having any technical difficulties, please type a note in the chat pod over to the right side of your screen, and I'll do what I can to help you. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat pod as well. We'll have a question and answer session after each presentation, and feel free to type in your questions anytime if you have them. The 5-year Northern Grapes Project just concluded this past August, but we will continue with Northern Grapes newsletters and a monthly webinar series thanks to these generous industry donations. Now I'd like to turn it over to David Jones for the first presentation tonight. And David, you should be all set to go.
Yep, hang on. Okay, there we are. Okay, thanks very much, Alex. Well, thanks for coming out to listen tonight, everyone. We appreciate it. I'm going to be starting the talk here with some information on the disease susceptibility of these cold climate cultivars. And then Patty will be getting into the copper sulfur work later, as mentioned. Let's see. All right. So to kick things off here, when we look at current information regarding the susceptibility of many cold climate wine grape cultivars to disease, we're often met with some uncertainty and question marks in the case of this table here. As we look across much of the literature that exists, you'll find this is the case. This particular table comes from the current grape disease management guide. But this is fairly true across what we'll find. And even in situations where we do have ratings, these 1, 2, or 3 plus signs, many of the ratings don't come from work that was conducted in multiple randomized studies in the absence of fungicides. So the point here being that there are inconsistencies within what we do know and some areas where we still have no idea whatsoever as to what the relative susceptibility to disease of these cultivars might be. So this project set out to try to change this, and we had 3 objectives going in. First, to determine the relative disease susceptibility to downy mildew, powdery mildew, and black rot in popular cold climate wine grape cultivars. Secondly, to determine distinctions between foliar and fruit susceptibility to disease, as this can have significant management applications. And 3, we wanted to generate extension literature to promote increased understanding of disease symptoms and signs, as we have found that there are some inconsistencies between what we see on the cold climate wine grape cultivars and what we might see in several disease compendia with images collected from Vitis vinifera, the European wine grape. The experimental design that we used for this work consisted of 3 vineyard sites, 200 vines per site, encompassing 8 popular cultivars that you'll be seeing shortly. Visual ratings were conducted for broad breakthrough harvest in both 2015 and 2016. And fungicides were withheld from the program entirely. So aside from the absence of fungicides, these vines were maintained in conventional manner. The visual scale that was used to rate these vines, 1 through 4, you can see the bulleted arrows there down below. It's kind of the drop down, the 1, 2, 3, and 4. And also on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the 2, a 3, and a 4, representing the 1 to 25% disease, 26 to 50% disease, and greater than 50% disease. This is just an example of what powdery mildew might have looked like, so you can kind of get an idea as we move into the graphs later on what I was looking for. Additionally, fruit cluster ratings were taken. As I mentioned, there was a distinction between foliar and fruit susceptibility made for all three diseases that we'll be discussing today. So in addition to conducting foliar ratings, we also conducted ratings to get a bit of a handle on what the susceptibility of the fruit was. The field sites that we used for this work, one vineyard was located at the West Madison Agricultural Research Station in Zone 5B. You can see that red star to the south of Wisconsin there near Madison. That's very near our home campus here at UW. And two vineyard sites called PARS 1 and PARS 2 for the duration of this presentation, both located in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. You can see on the peninsula there, that second red star. This is USDA Zone 5A. Do want to mention before we go forward that PARS 2 was only included in this work in 2016. So some of the panels that I'll be showing you later on have a different number of graphs between 2015 and 2016, and this is the reason for that. The pathogens that we're going to be discussing this evening are downy mildew, Plasmopara reticula, powdery mildew, Erysiphene necator, black rot, Guinardia bedwellii. We did not use any artificial inoculation in this work. This is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, two of these three pathogens, powdery mildew and downy mildew, are both obligate biotrophs. It means they need a living plant host to survive at any given time, and as scientists, it means that culturing these pathogens, bulking them up, to the scale that we would have needed to inoculate this many vines was beyond the scope of what we were going to be reasonably able to accomplish. But secondly, because we had previous reports of all three of these diseases causing problems at all of our field sites, we were reasonably confident that there was inoculum present in the sites for us to work with. So we're going to get right into the results here. I'm going to start off with the foliar downy mildew susceptibility results. We're going to be starting in 2015. There's a difference, as you can see, between the severity of susceptibility experienced by several of these cultivars, but a few important trends that I want to draw your attention to before we move into talking about the 2016 data. The first thing I want you to note is that Valiant, which is the black line, and Lacrosse, which is the red line, are at both sites most severely susceptible for the greatest part of the growing season. Now after this, we see that there is a difference in the severity of the disease that is experienced by the remaining cultivars, but that the pattern is actually quite similar. So you'll note that that green line there, Lacrescent, and the purple line, which is St. Croix, follow the same order going down after we see the red line and the black line for Valiant and Lacrosse. The other thing that I want you to draw your attention to before we move into 2016 is that cluster of three lines, the blue line, the light blue line, and the orange line you'll see on that leftmost panel. You'll note that those do not climb above a rating of 3, even in the very worst case scenario, you might say, in 2015 for those other cultivars. These three cultivars moving into 2016 are going to remain clustered together. So again, the blue line, the light blue, and the orange line, Frontenac, Frontenac Gris, and Marquette, staying fairly low in susceptibility through the duration of the growing season. Again, we see Lacrosse and Valiant creeping up early in the season, severe damage to both of those cultivars. And again, we also see the green line and the purple line, St. Croix and Lacrescent, very similar. I do want you to note that at PARS 2, we did not have Valiant or St. Croix planted. That's why those lines are absent. So in summary, we saw a wide array of susceptibility to foliar downy mildew. However, when we look at the fruit susceptibility to downy mildew, we see something much different. And in our trials, only one of the 8 cultivars that we tested was susceptible to damage on the fruits from this pathogen, and that was Valiant. Very severely damaged at all of our sites in all seasons, but the other 7 cultivars were not damaged by the pathogen. And you can see some pictures of what this looked like in the field. You see on those Valiant clusters circled in red both main symptoms of downy mildew on fruits that we're used to seeing. This is a red-fruited cultivar, so we see some premature pigmentation going on in several berries. And we also see that thick cottony mass of sporulation on the outside of those berries. Growing right next to them, we have, in this particular example, a Marquette cluster and a Frontenac cluster growing along without damage. So this is the first of 3 relative susceptibility tables that we're going to be showing you today. We have one for each disease we're going to be discussing. We have these stacked up against one another. You'll note we use a slightly different system than kind of the 1, the 2, or the 3. We were more curious as to how they compare to one another. So Our severe to high risk category, we've had Valiant, Lacrosse, and Lacrescent, moving down into that high to moderate range, St. Croix, moderate to low Brianna, and then that cluster of three, that blue line, the light blue line, and the orange line that were Frontenac, Gris, and Marquette. You'll also notice that this table does make a differentiation between foliar and fruit susceptibility to disease. In this case, Valiant has this one asterisk next to it, indicating it's the only one that we found to have problems in this area. All right, let's move into the powdery mildew susceptibility work. So in 2015, very significant difference between the severity of powdery mildew at our two field sites. You'll note at PARS 1, all but 2 cultivars went up to a severe disease rating of 4. However, you will note that Lacrescent and Valiant both stayed lower. Lacrescent peaked at around the moderate range, and Valiant stayed near the low end of disease susceptibility. You'll also note that at West Madison in 2015, those 2 cultivars were among the cultivars that flatlined there at a rating of 1. Now, moving into 2016, we again see Lacrescent hanging quite low, along with Valiant. You see in all 3 panels, they are among the 2 least susceptible to the disease. There's also a cluster of 3 cultivars that we've already talked about once that I want to draw your attention to again. If you take a look at the West Madison 2016 panel, you'll see Frontenac, Gris, and Marquette. Now, it's true that they are not in the severe susceptibility category. The point here being they are more susceptible than the other cultivars in this situation. And if you look at PARS 1 in 2015, PARS 1 in 2016, and PARS 2 in 2016, this is also the case. They are higher relative to many other cultivars. Also want you to note Brianna, that yellow line, if you look at West Madison in 2015, was a little bit higher than the others, and we see the same thing happen in PARS 1 in 2015, as well as PARS 2 and PARS 1 in 2016. Now, when we look at the fruit susceptibility to powdery mildew, we saw a much higher degree of consistency between the fruit and foliage for powdery mildew than we did with downy mildew. And that's to say that Brianna, Frontenac, and Frontenac Gris were among the more severely damaged to the foliage across our field sites. We also saw the same thing on the fruits. So you see that by September at both of our field sites, running around 50 to 60% damage from powdery mildew. On the other end of the spectrum, we saw that Lacrescent, which was among the lowest in terms of damage, as well as Valiant, stayed very low in terms of fruit damage from powdery mildew. The only surprise here is that Marquette, which was among the higher cultivars in terms of foliar damage to powdery mildew, did stay fairly low in fruit. So in summary, here's the second of the 2 tables that we have for you today. As you see up there, the severe to high risk, Brianna, Frontenac, Gris, and Marquette. Moving into that moderate category, we have Lacrosse, and then they're at the bottom in the low, St. Croix, and very low, Lacrescent and Valiant. Okay, and finally we're going to talk about the foliar black rot susceptibility rating. Now in 2015 you see that we saw a much reduced degree of separation between these 8 cultivars when you look at black rot as where we might compare to powdery mildew or downy mildew, where we saw quite a bit of separation between cultivars that first year. However, if we take a minute to consider the biology of the black rot pathogen, this is actually about what we would have expected. So the black rot fungus has a reduced ability to spread because the spores are shorter range than the sporangia and the conidia of the downy mildew and powdery mildew pathogens, respectively. So that is to say that in a single year, because these sites had been maintained conventionally prior to 2015, there wasn't the same ability for this pathogen to build up and cause significant amounts of damage in that second year. But as we're going to see shortly, in subsequent years of poor management, you really do see an explosion, particularly on more susceptible cultivars. However, before we move on, I do want to draw your attention to the green line, which is Lacrescent. You'll note at both sites staying very low relative to other cultivars. And you also see that in 2015 at West Madison, Marquette is already creeping up there higher than the others, along with Brianna. Now in 2016, we did see that separation between cultivars. And you note the 2 sites that were included for both years are the WMARS site, the WMARS site, and the PARS 1 site. And those 2 sites, the second year, we did see a big split off for the more susceptible cultivars as compared to cultivars like Lacrescent. Again, you see that green line staying quite low at all 3 sites in 2016. Interestingly, PARS 2, which as I mentioned was only included for 1 year, was maintained conventionally prior to this season, and rather than resembling its counterparts in 2016, like we saw for powdery and downy mildew, the results for PARS 2 in 2016 are actually much more reminiscent of the West Madison and PAR sites in 2015. Again, I think this kind of speaks to the ability of black rot to really kind of kick you that second or third year of bad management. In terms of the more susceptible cultivars, again, we see that the black line, Valiant, clearly very susceptible, and we also see that Marquette, pretty much across the board, is at least in the upper tier in terms of susceptibility. Some other cultivars, including Frontenac and Frontenac Gris, occasionally creep into the moderate to high range, but this is not necessarily uniform. Let's see. Alex, I'm having trouble advancing my slide here. I think I've lost the ability to do that. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, you should be all set.
Yep, I am now a presenter.
Okay.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. All right. So next we looked at the black rot incidence for clusters. Now this is the percentage of clusters damaged per cultivar per site. You can see that Marquette and Valiant, both pretty severely susceptible on the clusters. Now Marquette, not necessarily the most severely damaged at all of our sites. But what I do want you to note is that it's consistently damaged as opposed to being very badly damaged or very minimally damaged, as we see for Frontenac, Frontenac Gris. So this, again, kind of speaks to the consistent susceptibility we saw from Marquette to this disease and the presence of some of what we might more call those middling cultivars that are in the moderate to high range for susceptibility, but perhaps not quite as susceptible as Marquette or Valiant. On the other end of the spectrum, we see that La Crescent, which I'll remind you was consistently very low for foliar susceptibility to black rot. We see the same thing on the fruits, very low amount of damage compared to the other cultivars. We also see Brianna staying fairly low in this category across the board. Now, when we move into severity, should mention that severity is the percentage of an individual cluster destroyed by black rot. So I told you about the number of clusters per cultivar damage. This is what amount of an individual cluster is destroyed by black rot. We see pretty similar bars, really not a lot of difference here between the incidence and severity. In summary, this is basically to say that a cultivar that has a strong probability of having a lot of clusters damaged also seems to have quite a bit more damage on an individual cluster than less susceptible cultivars. Again, we see Marquette and Valiant showing up pretty consistently, and also some problems with Frontenac and Frontenac Gris in particular. And Alex, I seem to have lost control of the presentation again. Not really sure what's going on. There we go.
Okay.
Yep, no problem.
Are you just signed in on your computer?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, you should be set.
Okay, no problem. All right. And looking at the other end of the spectrum on fruit black rot severity, again, we kind of see La Crescent staying very low there. Now, Brianna did tick up a little bit in this category, but the takeaway here is that La Crescent consistently very low across the board here. Foliage, overall number of clusters damaged by disease, and low percentage of an individual cluster destroyed. So in summary, here's the final of the 3 susceptibility tables that we have for you here today. In the severe to high susceptibility categories, we have Valiant, Marquette, Frontenac, Frontenac Gris. In the moderate range, we have La Crosse, and then that low to very low category. In the low, we have Brianna and St. Croix, and again, that green line throughout the presentation, La Crescent, staying quite low in all categories that we looked at. So I'm going to leave you with some thoughts that Patty is going to expand upon shortly here. But the direction that we're headed with this work, and this combines quite well with the copper sulfur work that will be discussed momentarily, is how we can treat these grapes differently than the Vitis vinifera grapes, how we can target our spray programs to be smarter, more economical. This chart here is taken from the University of Kentucky's pathology site for grapes, and the only points here that I want to make are that many sprays during the growing season in a conventional program are directed at either black rot, powdery mildew, or downy mildew. You can see BR, PM, and DM. The point here being that the elimination of or reduction of sprays at even one of these diseases could represent significant savings for growers. The other point here just being that 16 sprays, 16 plus sprays in fact, is quite a lot in terms of investment for a grower. And if we could minimize or reduce that amount of spray, it's more environmental and also quite a bit more economically friendly. So what we're going to be looking at in the future is starting to try to cater specific spray programs by cultivar based on susceptibility to disease. Now, I want to emphasize this slide is not meant to be a recommendation at this time. We have not yet tested this program. This is simply a concept that we kind of want to leave you with today. But this particular example is just discussing what we might look at for Marquette in the future. Now, you'll recall during the presentation that Marquette had a very low risk of damage from downy mildew on the foliage and was not susceptible to downy mildew on the fruit. Conversely, it was fairly susceptible to foliar powdery mildew and clearly had some problems with black rot on the fruit. So the modified spray program for Marquette does not take into account downy mildew so much as it focuses very much on targeting black rot that affects fruit during that peak window of susceptibility early in the growing season. Some great research out of Cornell shows us that fruits are most susceptible to black rot between bloom and around 4 to 5 weeks post-bloom. So really getting that black rot in check early in the season, as well as that powdery mildew, and then making covers for powdery mildew on the foliage as needed throughout the growing season. So the point here being that you can imagine even if we made 3 additional sprays in that additional covers section there at the bottom, this is still only 8 sprays compared with what many conventional charts will recommend, 16 or more sprays in a single season. And it's true that not all growers do spray 16 times in a season, but you certainly talk to people who do, and we don't necessarily have proof of concept on the fact that we can't in many cases. So our conclusions at this time, both severe susceptibility and relative resistance do exist in the super hardy cultivars to all 3 of these diseases, and that cultivar choice, because of this, cultivar choice may influence disease management practices in the future. Additionally, that some important distinctions between fruit and foliar susceptibility should be expressed, particularly for downy mildew, as we see a huge difference between foliar susceptibility and fruit susceptibility to this disease. And finally, that additional cold climate cultivars should be added and compared to this work. We're pretty pleased with the selection of cultivars that we were able to study, but obviously we weren't able to get all of them. Several newer cultivars or some older standards like Sabreva, a newer one like Petit Pearl we have not added, and that would be nice to have those in there as well. And the one final thing I want to say is, in a conclusion to this work, is that there really is no silver bullet cultivar to these 3 diseases. That is to say, we didn't find a cultivar that was good against all 3. Most of them, you're picking 1 to 2 diseases they are less susceptible to. So with that, I just want to leave this acknowledgement slide up here and thank everyone who makes this work possible. We just have a really amazing team here at the UW that makes this work very, very gratifying, very, very fun. And also, of course, the Northern Grapes Project for their funding and support throughout this project. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Dave. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat bar in the lower right side of the meeting. And we have a couple minutes, so Dave, I guess we could wait a minute or 2 for some questions to come in.
Yep, of course.
Any questions for Dave? So Mike White has a comment. He writes, environment is a big factor. La Crescent in Iowa is very susceptible to black rot. We've had areas in Iowa that have gotten over 50 inches of rain, and 50 inches of rain can cause Marquette to be hit especially hard with downy mildew on the leaves.
Yep, and that's definitely, environment is a huge consideration. That's one of the hardest things to get a handle on because it does differ so greatly across regions, even throughout the Midwest. So, yep, that's an excellent point. We didn't talk about environment today, but we certainly do acknowledge it's a big factor.
So Rich Evans has a question. Should I still, should I still spray my Frontenac Blanc for downy mildew if it is not susceptible?
Yeah, we are not recommending at this time that anyone eliminate sprays. Can't emphasize enough that we haven't tested these reduced spray programs yet. These are really just concepts at this time. And kind of like I believe Mike mentioned, And environment is a huge factor. We had a good spread of sites, a good spread of environments. However, we don't necessarily feel confident this time that we can say you shouldn't spray at all. We're more advocating a reduced input system at this time, and this is going to be something that we have to back up with future work.
Austin writes, curious if there is any distinction between applications or lack of and production of the vine. What is the return of rate for the applications?
You know, at this time we don't really have yield data for this study. Big problem here is that we had so much disease that collecting yield data was not really something that we were able to do within the scope of this work. And again, I wish I had a better, more information for you, but at this time we really don't know. That's going to, again, be something that we have to look at in the future when we start cutting back on sprays. What does yield look like over time, and also how does that compare with vines that we don't spray at all or spray conventionally?
We had a comment too from Alistair. Very interesting stats. I have frontenaceae, black rot first year, spray 8 times a year, none over the past 2 years.
So I believe he's saying sprayed 8 times the first year and has had no black rot for 2 years. I'm not quite sure.
Yes. Yeah, Alistair, can you clarify that?
Well, if that is the case, Alistair, didn't spray
first year.
Okay, now eight sprays a year. Okay. Yeah, I mean black rot. What we really see in our work, you know, these vines were very well maintained. Very tight fungicide programs prior to the 2015 growing season. You know, really didn't see much in the way of black rot on a lot of these cultivars that first year. And you know, if you look at that 1 year, you kind of think, well, geez, this isn't bad at all. A lot of these cultivars aren't too terrible. But yes, a couple years after you slack off that fungicide regimen, pretty clear that you can have some serious problems on many, if not all, these cultivars.
Great. And then last quick question, will these study results be available online, including the spray recommendations? So Steve, this presentation will be posted online. Dave, if you have additional links, maybe you could include them in the chat bar after your presentation.
Okay, sounds good.
Great. So, Dave, I think, are you still planning on sticking around?
Yep, I'll be around.
Great. So if you do have any additional questions for Dave, please feel free to continue using the chat bar. But now I think I'll turn it over to Patty. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, Patty, so you are the presenter.
Okay. Well, thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. So Dave went over Cultivar Susceptibility, and a few years ago, or over the past few years, along with Victoria Cartanos and Matt Stasiak, a couple of workers at UW-Madison, we looked at the sensitivity of cold climate varieties to copper and sulfur fungicides, and also to the fungicide difenoconazole. I'm going to talk just very quickly about the copper and sulfur work, but the point here tonight is to talk about how we can take what Dave has learned in his research and combine it with what we've learned with copper and sulfur and work out spray programs. What are some of the considerations that we have to take in when we do that? So I am not going to go into a whole lot of detail on the copper and sulfur work because I gave a webinar back in April, and that's in the archives. And likewise, I wrote a newsletter article for the Northern Grapes News about a year ago. And so the details on the methods and you know, just sort of the nitty-gritty of the experiments is there. But I do just want to quickly go over why we did the work and some of the big picture results. So copper and sulfur fungicides have been around for a long time. Sulfur actually for millennia, and copper for a few hundred years. And nevertheless, they're still really good fungicides to use in viticulture. Copper is highly effective on downy mildew, and it has a little bit of activity against black rot and phomopsis But really, there are a lot of other fungicides that are much better than copper at controlling those other diseases. So its real role on grapevine is downy mildew. And then sulfur, its role on grapes is powdery mildew. It really has no activity on other pathogens. So Dave showed this table for his presentation, focusing on the question marks for all the susceptibility to different diseases. And over on the right are all the question marks that we have for sensitivity to either sulfur or copper. And so this was really the impetus for this research, was to try to get rid of some of those question marks, to put out trials where they were replicated, randomized, and repeated over years. So our work was conducted at the two locations that Dave mentioned, the research station in Madison and then the one up in the Door Peninsula. And the varieties that were included were those that are listed on this slide. And there were 11, or a maximum of 11 trials. So some of those varieties were tested in 11 independent trials. Some of them in as few as 5 trials, some of them at some number in between. But even at 5 trials, when you start getting consistent results, you start to gain confidence in the results. And so that was conducted over 4 years, 2012 to 2015. Just quickly, the results, we found that Brianna was highly sensitive to copper. Now in this photo, this is actually late in the season. You can see the bird netting there. There were probably somewhere between 4 or 5, maybe even 6 sprays of copper applied at this point. And so you can see the really severe leaf russeting. That was pretty typical of copper injury. So our recommendation from this then is that you probably do not want to apply copper to Brianna. And in fact, that slide was after 4 or more applications, but even after 1 or 2 applications of copper, Brianna sometimes showed a bad reaction. Now there were a number of other cultivars listed there where only in 1 or 2 trials did we see what we thought might have been some reaction. But to be conservative, I guess I'm recommending that you would maybe want to restrict copper to just 1 or 2 sprays per season and avoid consecutive sprays. So maybe copper in these cases would be used to alternate with a sterile inhibitor or with strobilurin fungicide, something perhaps for fungicide resistance management. In terms of injury to sulfur, pictured here is Marechal Foch. And you can see, particularly on that leaf in the lower right-hand quadrant, the browning and curling of the leaf margins. And we saw this also pretty severely on Leon Malo and a little bit on Brianna. And for the most part, other varieties weren't too badly affected, but really Foch and its sibling variety, Leon Malo, were the worst affected. So that is probably in about late July, but here is later in the season. So again, you can see the bird netting, and you've got clusters of fruit hanging there, and they've turned red, but it's very likely that the bricks are not what you would want them to be in that cordon that was sprayed with sulfur. So the cordon on the right was not sprayed with sulfur. So pretty devastating results if you spray a variety that's sensitive to sulfur. So do not apply sulfur to Marechal Foch, Leon Malo, or Brianna. And we would recommend, it's probably a conservative recommendation, but restricting sulfur to 1 or 2 sprays per season on La Crescent and St. Croix, because there were a couple of trials in which those showed a slight reaction. So in considering whether you would want to use copper and sulfur, there are a number of things to take into account. And first one might seem kind of like, well, duh, but you know, do you really have a reason to use copper or sulfur? So if you're growing grapes and you're doing a great job, you're making money, the fruit are good, the wine is good, maybe you don't want to try to fix something that isn't broken. But if you're an organic grower, copper and sulfur, or if you're thinking about organic or wanting to transition, Copper and sulfur are going to be important fungicides in your program. If you're a conventional grower, even if things are going great now, you do need to be thinking about fungicide resistance management. So if you're relying on the sterol demethylation inhibitor fungicides, things like Raleigh, Vintage, tebuconazole, if you're using those 3, 4, or more times per season, you're really going to run the risk of getting into fungicide resistance problems. And then a third consideration where copper or sulfur might come in handy is to save money. So it used to be that copper was a pretty economical fungicide. More these days, the price of copper has gone up. Sulfur, though, is still pretty cheap in terms of powdery mildew control. It's cheaper than most of the other fungicides out there. So those are just some of the reasons that you might consider using copper and sulfur. It is important to think about the compatibility of copper and sulfur with other products that you might be using. So in our trials, we applied copper or sulfur alone. And the actual products that we used, I would encourage you to go back and look at the newsletter. We used a couple of different products, but no spreader stickers, no adjuvants of any kind, no tank mixes with other products. That's not to say that you couldn't do that, but I just want to emphasize that in our trials, we did not do it. So sometimes when you start mixing things together, you'll run into toxicity problems because there might be something in the mixing partner that lowers the pH, makes copper more available, or enhances its uptake. So do read labels carefully if you're going to be trying to mix with copper and sulfur, or even in alternating copper and sulfur with other products. So copper incompatibility in particular, I just alluded to pH. So copper fungicides should not be mixed with phosphorus acid fungicides. That would be things like Fostrol, Aliette, Rampart, Agrifos. There's a number of them. Or any product, or even water if you've got very low pH water. The reason for this is that at lower pH, copper ions tend to be released from these fixed fungicides more quickly. So by fixed, copper salts, when they're made into fungicides, there's typically either lime or gypsum or something like that added to raise the pH to make them more safe for plants. So you lower the pH, and then those ions are going to become available more quickly. It means that the fungicide will be more effective, but it also means you're going to be burning leaf tissue because copper and sulfur are both general biocides. They don't really distinguish well between fungi and plants. Because some forms of copper are quite persistent, you would want to consider the interval between using copper and phosphorus acid sprays. And in fact, I guess because it's not my vineyard, and I feel like I need to be conservative in making any kind of recommendations. I would say certainly if you see any residue, and I have seen the blue residues of copper hang around for several weeks when there hasn't been much rain. If you're seeing copper residues, you probably don't want to apply phosphorus acid. Or if you have applied phosphorus acid recently, you don't want to add copper. And then the weather at the time of application is a really important consideration with copper and sulfur. So in our trials, in 2012, you might remember it was a hot summer, even in Wisconsin, which is farther north than where many of you are. That was the one year when we saw the worst sulfur injury on Marichal Foch and Leon Malo. But in most of our trials, the temperatures were in the 60s or 70s at the time of spray, and then even later on in the day, it never got above about 85 degrees, so relatively mild weather. So that may be one factor why we didn't get a lot of sulfur injury. So that's kind of just a word of warning. If you're in a warmer climate, treat sulfur with a little more respect. Contrary to that, with copper, the risk of injury increases with cooler temperatures and prolonged periods of wetness. And so you get these damp, rainy, cool days where everything's wet for 24, 48 hours. And what happens then is if you have copper residue, the more it's wet, the more that the ions can come out and into solution where they can injure plants. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit more. Dave was touching on what you can possibly, how we can apply this knowledge in spray programs. And as Dave did, I want to emphasize that these are just possible spray programs. We haven't tested them yet. We're going to be doing some testing. But I also know that a lot of growers do their own experimenting, and certainly if you, look at what we've done here and have questions and want to come up with some spray programs where you take advantage of cultivar resistance and maybe lay off certain fungicides, I'd be happy to work on them with you on a spray program where we might be able to accomplish that. But in addition to downy mildew, powdery mildew, and black rot, which was the main focus of Dave's work, in addition to those diseases, we need to be mindful of other problems like phomopsis and anthracnose. Now, in our trials, we did not see any anthracnose. So our vineyards were planted in 2012, and one of them, the second PARS site, was in about 2008. So it, and like Dave mentioned, they were sprayed up until 2015. So we think some of these diseases like phomopsis and anthracnose probably take a little longer to gain a foothold. So we certainly have them in the state. And there was some phomopsis, but thus far we haven't seen anthracnose. But we are not going to fool ourselves into thinking we're never going to get them. If you are a conventional grower, you will want to have on hand either the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide or the Michigan Guide or Cornell. I don't care which one you have, but have a guide on hand, because in any of those, there will be a table that tells you the efficacy of the different fungicides. This Midwest Guide you can Google and get it online. You can also buy it from Purdue University. The Organic Production and IPM Guide for Grapes, this is out of Cornell University, and I find it very useful. I haven't done a lot of research into organic myself, and so I rely on that guide frequently if I'm trying to advise organic growers. Okay, so here in this slide, what we've done is taken essentially Dave's master's thesis and boiled it down to one slide. So the cultivars along the bottom are resistant to the diseases, downy mildew, powdery mildew, black rot, and then those towards the top are more susceptible. And so as Dave said, there's no perfect cultivar. There's none that was just highly resistant to all three diseases. Nevertheless, one I do want to point out is La Crescent. So with La Crescent, although it was very susceptible to foliar or downy mildew, it was quite resistant in our trials to powdery mildew and black rot. Let's see. And for this reason, at least in some climates, this might be a cultivar that would lend itself to organic production. So the reason I say this is that black rot is really the Achilles heel of organic production. There's very few, the arsenal of fungicides that are accepted by organic certification programs just aren't very effective on black rot. But with La Crescent, we seem to have fairly good resistance to it. On the other hand, copper compounds are available to organic growers, and so those would be effective in controlling downy mildew. And so if we look at a potential spray program, it might consist of a dormant spray of lime sulfur or liquid lime sulfur for phomopsis or anthracnose. And that would be based more on history. If you've never seen those diseases, then they're not going to show up one year and all of a sudden wipe you out. They're the type of diseases that will build up. So you don't want to ignore them, but on the other hand, if you've never seen them, I don't know that that dormant spray is going to do you much good. Bud break through pre-bloom, fixed copper for downy mildew. And perhaps that would also have some activity against phomopsis. And now bloom through 4 weeks post-bloom, this is on varieties where fruit is susceptible. This is a key time to protect fruit. Dave's work showed that the fruit appeared to be fairly resistant to downy mildew. Nevertheless, we want to play it safe until we actually do some testing on these. And so there would probably be a need for copper there as well. But now, Lecrescent, if you might remember, was one of those that I said, boy, I don't know if you really want to spray more than 1 or 2 sprays per year. But you're going to need more than 1 spray and probably more than 2 sprays even from that bud break through 4 weeks post-bloom period. So I guess if you need to go use more copper, you would want to try to apply it when conditions are not cool and wet and are going to be predicted to be cool and wet for several days. So try to aim for drier periods. Copper really is protective anyway, and so you want to get it on before you have infections. You don't want to put it on after you have an outbreak of downy mildew. Now during the period after bloom, there might be a need for botrytis control, and there are some organic options, including Serenade, that at least some trials have had some activity against botrytis. I would say there's nothing that has really just excelled uniformly when I look at trials, not my own trials, but other people who've worked on that. And then with Lecrescent, it appears to be fairly resistant for powdery mildew, seems to be fairly resistant, but through harvest, I think would be based on scouting, and sulfur would certainly be an adequate fungicide. So that was an organic program. If we looked at a possible reduced risk program, and by reduced risk, what I mean by that is getting rid of some of the harsher fungicides, things like Captan and Mancozeb, that are known to have a pretty, well, they're potential carcinogens and a little bit harsher environmental profile. So again, if we did a dormant spray for if there was a history of Phomopsis or Anthracnose, and then early in the season, rather than copper, a conventional grower might consider phosphorus acid for downy mildew. Could replace Captan or Mancozeb, or perhaps rotate with those fungicides. And then bloom through 4 weeks post-bloom. Again, you could have phosphorus acid alternated with strobilurin, and this would control multiple diseases. So the strobilurin would have some activity against Phomopsis if that was showing up, and also against botrytis. And then through harvest, again, because Lecrescent is not super susceptible to powdery mildew, which tends to be our late season disease, just based on scouting, sulfur or a rotation of sulfur and a strobilurin would probably be adequate. Okay, so that was Lecrescent. And I'm not going to go through every cultivar here. In fact, Mark, just want to do an example with Marquette. But Marquette's kind of the opposite of Lecrescent. So Marquette is actually fairly resistant in our trials, both the fruit and the leaves, but especially the fruit, to downy mildew, and but very susceptible to black rot. And so I wouldn't say that you can't grow Marquette organically, but it would not be a variety that I would recommend for organic, simply because of that difficulty in controlling black rot with the options that are available. But if you're organic or a conventional grower, either way, a really critical non-chemical but rather cultural practice is removing the black rot mummies from the ground, and especially from the trellis before bud break. And so if you have those mummies over winter and then you get springtime rain, if you look over on the right, that's a close-up of those mummies. And then a super close-up shows those white squiggly things, and that's actually masses, hundreds and thousands of spores coming out of those mummies that were allowed to overwinter. And so that can cause a lot of trouble. To get those out before bud break, that's a big head start in controlling black rot. So a possible reduced risk program would be the potential dormant spray, and then the bud break up to pre-bloom. Rather than being obsessed with downy mildew, as we often have to be for some of the other varieties, you could use phosphorus acid or perhaps a fixed copper based on weather and scouting. And so if it's fairly dry, then maybe you wouldn't even need to manage downy mildew. But what's going to be really important, though, is the pre-bloom through about 4 weeks post-bloom black rot control and potentially phomopsis at this period as well. And so this is where a DMI fungicide alternated with the strobilurin would come into play. And then post-harvest, sulfur for powdery mildew based on scouting. Marquette was a little bit more susceptible to powdery mildew, so maybe you'd want to include a DMI fungicide to rotate with, but sulfur is a pretty good mildew fungicide, powdery mildew fungicide. So before finishing up, just one thing I want to mention is that copper and sulfur really are more protective in activity. Neither one of these has very good post-infection activity. And so copper, in fact, is strictly protective. Sulfur is primarily protective. You can get some post-infection control if applied after infection, but before the powdery mildew growth actually appears. And so during summer months, it depends on the variety and the location. That's about a week. But if you've gone on vacation and you're following the weather back home and there's all this rain going on and you're going, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And you come back and you want to try to clean up any infections that might have happened, copper and sulfur wouldn't be the choices. You'd want to go with something with post-infection activity. A sterile inhibitor would probably be best, or a strobilurin. So other fungicides just provide better post-infection activity. So again, that's what I have presented. We are going to be doing some research on some reduced spray programs, and if you're interested in trialing things in your own vineyard, I'd be more than interested in talking to you about it. So let's see. So that's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Patty. We have a couple questions coming in, so as a reminder, feel free to submit any questions for Patty in the next few minutes in the chat box on the lower right side of your screen. So looking through, let's see, the first question from Austin. How did the sprays that you mentioned affect beneficial insects or soil quality, if at all? Do years of these applications impact the soil quality?
Yeah, good question. The work on beneficials, I'm thinking particularly, well, sulfur actually has some impact, negative impact on beneficial mites. Copper, that research has been a little spottier, but the effect of copper on soil is not good. It tends to accumulate in soil, and in Europe, this has been a concern in some of the vineyards there. So certainly something to keep in mind long term.
And then Austin followed up and asked, are there any beneficial nematodes that would help with any of these issues?
I'm not aware of any on grapes. I'm looking over at Dave. He's, certainly they're not showing up in any of the spray guides that I've looked at. The one that I'm involved, the Midwest one that I'm involved in, or but even the other ones that I've looked at. So not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you, Austin, for your questions. Larry asks, is it sufficient to cut and drop black rot mummies to the ground, or should they be removed from the vineyard altogether?
Yeah, better to get them out of the vineyard, but to the ground is certainly better than leaving them hanging in the trellis. I would say if you're organic, getting them out completely, and you've got a susceptible variety like Marquette or Frontenac, you want to get them out altogether. If you're a conventional grower and you're using, mancozeb or some little more heavy-duty fungicides on black rot, you might be able to get away with leaving them on the ground.
Okay, great. And another question from Austin. How do you offset the effects of copper on soils if you can?
How do you offset? Oh, well, I haven't really done a lot of research on that. By research, I mean just digging through the literature to find out. So, organic matter, just helping keep the soil fresh in that way. But sorry, no good answer for you on there. I guess the key thing is to when you spray, try to use a volume that's going to get your canopy wet, but not with a lot of dripping off into the, so that it directly goes to the soil.
Okay, and we have a comment from Mike White. The number of fungicide sprays tend to decrease as you go further north. For example, 10 to 12 times in Missouri, 8 to 10 in Iowa, 4 to 6 in Minnesota or Wisconsin. That couple extra weeks of foliage early in the season seems to increase the potential for diseases later into the season, and that brings us back to the environment again.
Yeah, I don't know, Mike. The solution for that, I guess, is everybody move to Wisconsin and grow here. No, I know it's we may have gotten away with things in our work that you can't get away with in other areas. We have to keep that in mind.
Mike responded, okay, I love Wisconsin.
Okay. Football team's doing okay.
So we have another minute or two if anyone has any last minute questions for Patty.
Or Dave.
Or Dave. Dave is here too.
Yep.
If not, you feel free to email me. I'll put my email address in the chat box, and it's on the Northern Grapes Project website as well. And I can forward any questions to Patty or Dave. Tim Martinson writes, in my opinion, copper is a heavy metal. It will build up over time, and it stays there. In Europe, after greater than 100 years of copper, levels in soils are still very high.
Yeah, and this morning we actually discussed a little bit that it's really being discouraged in organic production. Not banned. I thought it was actually banned for organic production in Europe, but I got set straight on that. It's being discouraged because it's accumulated to a high degree in Europe. So.
Okay, well, I think that concludes tonight's presentations. Thank you again, David and Patty, for your excellent presentations. And thank you to all the participants and our sponsors for their continued support of the Northern Grapes webinar series. So as a reminder, the webinar series will continue on Tuesdays of each month through May. The next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, February 14th, and it'll discuss how variety trials from the NE 1020 coordinated variety trials have performed. And that'll be presented by Tim Martinson and a panel from across several states in the Midwest and Northeast. Slides and a recording of this webinar will be posted on the Northern Grapes Project website, and also make sure to visit our Facebook page and feel free to email me any additional questions you may have from today's webinar, and I can forward those to Patty or Dave. So thank you again, Patty and Dave. We really appreciate your time, and those are excellent presentations. There was a lot of questions and good discussion on the chat bar, so thank you again.
Yep, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. We'll see you next month.